Aisha sat by the bedroom window, watching the late afternoon sun bathe the garden in a golden glow. The gentle breeze carried the fragrance of jasmine, and she rested a protective hand over her slightly rounded belly. Life, she thought, had finally given her everything she'd ever prayed for: a loving husband, a home of her own, and the joy of expecting her first child. She often replayed her wedding day in her mind, the warm smiles, the music, the feeling of stepping into a future she had imagined since she was a little girl. Imran had been attentive from the beginning, the kind of man who remembered her favorite colors, who listened when she spoke, and who laughed at her jokes even when they weren't that funny. Their evenings together were quiet but fulfilling. Shared meals, long walks, and conversations about baby names and how they'd decorate the nursery. Her in-laws, at first glance, seemed welcoming. Her mother-in-law had given her a warm hug the day she moved in, her father-in-law had complimented her cooking, and her sister-in-law had offered to show her around the neighborhood. It was all so perfect on the surface that Aisha convinced herself she had been blessed with not only a good husband but also a second family who accepted her. In her heart, she believed kindness could win over any distance or difference, so she poured herself into being the best daughter-in-law she could be. Waking early to help in the kitchen, making sure the house was always tidy, and greeting everyone with a smile. Yet, here and there, little moments tugged at the edge of her happiness. There were the faint sighs her mother-in-law let out when Aisha added a pinch too much salt to a dish, the barely concealed smirk from her sister-in-law when she spoke about her plans for the nursery, and the way her father-in-law sometimes cut her off mid-sentence, as though her words were unimportant. They were small things, easy to overlook, and Aisha told herself they were just signs of adjusting to a new home and new people. After all, she was the newcomer here. Perhaps they simply needed time to understand her. Imran never seemed to notice these things. When she mentioned them casually, he would chuckle and say, "You're overthinking, Aisha. They love you." His reassurances were like soft blankets she wrapped around herself, covering any cracks that might let in the cold. She wanted to believe him because the alternative, that her dream family might not be as perfect as she thought, was too heavy to carry in her heart. So she smiled, she cooked their favorite meals, and she told herself that love, patience, and time would weave them all together like threads in a beautiful fabric. At night, as she lay beside Imran listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, she would imagine their child growing in a warm, safe home filled with laughter. She didn't notice the faint shadows creeping into the corners of her perfect illusion, nor the quiet, calculating glances that sometimes followed her when she turned her back. For now, she chose to see only the sunlight. It began so subtly that Aisha almost didn't notice at first. The warm smiles from her mother-in-law became less frequent, replaced by pursed lips and raised eyebrows whenever Aisha made a decision without consulting the elders. Her sister-in-law, Saba, had a way of delivering comments that sounded like jokes on the surface but stung deeply once they settled in. "Oh, Aisha," Saba would laugh as they sat together in the living room, "you have such simple tastes. I guess not everyone can be born with style." Everyone else would chuckle, and Aisha would smile politely, swallowing the ache in her chest. It was easier to pretend it didn't bother her. At first, she thought it was just a matter of adjustment. She told herself that every family had its quirks, that maybe she was being too sensitive. But the incidents started piling up. One morning, she overslept slightly due to pregnancy fatigue, only to find her mother-in-law already in the kitchen, banging pots a little too loudly. "In our home, daughters-in-law don't sleep in," she remarked coolly, glancing pointedly at the clock. The implication hung in the air. Aisha was lazy, unworthy of the role she had been given. The control seeped into every aspect of her day. Her mother-in-law insisted on approving every grocery list, every purchase, even the clothes Aisha wore when she went outside. "You're expecting," she would say, "so it's important to represent the family with dignity." It was always framed as concern, but Aisha felt the invisible chains tightening. The few times she suggested visiting her own parents, there was always a reason to discourage her. "The roads are too busy," her mother-in-law would say. "It's not safe in your condition." Or Saba would suddenly claim she needed Aisha's help with something trivial. Her phone calls with her family grew shorter. At first, she spoke to her brother, Hamza, almost every day, sharing little updates about the baby and her life. But soon, she found herself talking to him less and less, always with one ear tuned to the hallway, worried someone might overhear. Hamza had always been fiercely protective, the kind of brother who would defend her without hesitation. She didn't want to alarm him, didn't want to invite conflict into her marriage. Imran, meanwhile, seemed blind to it all. When she tried to bring it up, he would wave it off with a soft laugh. Aisha, they don't mean any harm. You know how families can be. It's better not to create tension over small things. His calmness might have been comforting once, but now it felt like a wall she couldn't climb. The more she tried to explain, the more he urged her to just let it go. Peace to him was more important than taking sides, even if it meant leaving her to endure the small daily cuts alone. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit in the quiet of her room and feel the weight of the house pressing in around her. It wasn't physical abuse, but it was something just as suffocating, a steady erosion of her confidence, a constant reminder that she was an outsider here. She told herself she could handle it, that she had to stay strong for the baby. But in the corners of her mind, a tiny voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this home wasn't as safe as she had once believed. She pushed the thought away, clinging to the hope that things would get better, not yet realizing that the cracks were only beginning to spread. The change was no longer subtle. The undercurrents of hostility that once flowed quietly beneath the surface now came in sharp, visible waves. It was in the way her mother-in-law's eyes lingered on her every move, searching for something to criticize. It was in Saba's constant whispers to relatives on the phone, the sudden silences when Aisha entered the room. Every day seemed to bring a new reason to tell her she had embarrassed the family. If she forgot to iron Imran's shirt before he left for work, it was proof she wasn't a proper wife. If she laughed too loudly during a TV show, she was told women in respectable households behaved with more grace. Once, she greeted a male neighbor who was passing by, simply out of courtesy, and her mother-in-law accused her of being too friendly and drawing attention in a way that shamed their name. The accusations over petty matters built up like layers of dust she could never sweep away. Aisha found herself constantly second-guessing everything she did, from the way she stirred the tea to the number of minutes she spent on the balcony. No matter how much she tried to be perfect, it was never enough. The air in the house had grown heavy, laced with judgment and disdain. It all came to a head one Saturday afternoon during a large family gathering at their home. Relatives filled the living room, children played in the courtyard, and the table was laden with food Aisha had spent hours helping to prepare. She had been careful all day, keeping her tone polite, her smile constant, her movements graceful. She thought, perhaps, she might get through this event without incident. But trouble has a way of finding those who are already marked for it. The conversation among the guests turned to the topic of family traditions, and someone casually mentioned how different households handled certain customs. Aisha, trying to contribute, said lightly, "In my parents' home, we do it a little differently, but I think both ways are beautiful." It was an innocent remark, but the moment the words left her mouth, she saw the sharp flicker in her mother-in-law's eyes. The room went silent as her mother-in-law put down her teacup and turned to her with a tight, cold smile. "Beautiful," she repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. "So now our ways aren't good enough for you? You've been here a year, Aisha, and already you think you can compare our traditions to your own? Perhaps you think your family's ways are better than ours." Aisha's cheeks burned as all eyes turned to her. She opened her mouth to explain, but her mother-in-law didn't give her the chance. Her voice grew louder, carrying across the room. "This is exactly what I've been saying. You've brought your arrogance into our home and no respect for the family that took you in. Even while you're carrying our child, you bring shame with your words." The word shame landed like a stone in Aisha's stomach. She felt small, exposed, and utterly powerless under the weight of so many stares. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably, others looked away, but no one spoke up. Not even Imran. He sat frozen beside her, his jaw tight but his lips sealed. Aisha's hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to defend herself, to say that she meant no disrespect, but her voice was lodged somewhere deep in her throat. In that moment, she realized it wasn't just embarrassment she felt, it was fear. Fear of how far her in-laws would go to control her. Fear of how little her husband would do to protect her. For the first time since her marriage, she felt truly unsafe in that house. That night, lying awake in the dark, her mind kept replaying the scene. The humiliation had seeped into her bones, making her chest ache. Her phone sat on the bedside table, and her fingers itched to call Hamza. He would understand. He would be furious. He would come. But that was the problem. If Hamza stormed into this house, the fragile thread holding her marriage together would snap. Her in-laws would twist the story, turn Imran against her, and she feared the fallout would be worse than the pain she already endured. So she turned her face into the pillow, clutching her belly as if to shield her child from the poison in the air, and forced herself not to dial the number she knew by heart. For now, she would keep her silence. But deep inside, a crack had widened, and there was no going back to the perfect illusion she once clung to. The days after the family gathering were colder, heavier. Aisha could feel the shift in the air, though no one spoke of it directly. Her mother-in-law's eyes followed her every movement with a sharpness that made her skin prickle. Saba whispered in corners more often, her gaze darting toward Aisha with a strange mix of satisfaction and malice. Even the father-in-law, who usually stayed silent, seemed to watch her as though waiting for her to trip over some invisible line. Imran, unaware or unwilling to see the growing tension, announced one evening that he would be leaving for a 3-day business trip. He kissed her forehead and promised to call, his suitcase neatly packed by the door. Aisha forced a smile, though something deep inside her clenched with unease. She didn't like the idea of being left alone with them. She had been managing so far, but lately, there was an edge to their hostility, a kind of simmering intent that she couldn't quite name. What she didn't know was that in the quiet hours after she went to bed, her in-laws had already begun plotting. In their minds, Aisha needed to be taught her place, shown that defiance, even in the form of a harmless opinion, would not be tolerated. Her mother-in-law, drawing from the toxic traditions of her own upbringing, spoke of an old lesson used to shame women who forgot their place in the household. Saba's eyes lit up as she listened, her lips curling into a smile that had nothing to do with kindness. They decided that with Imran away, it was the perfect opportunity. The plan was cruel in its simplicity. To paint Aisha's face black and force her to walk outside in front of the neighbors, parading her as an example of a dishonorable wife. They told themselves it was a warning, a way to bring her back into submission. To them, it wasn't abuse, it was tradition. The next day began as any other, but Aisha felt the strangeness in their behavior. Her mother-in-law was almost too polite in the morning, offering tea with a sugary smile that didn't reach her eyes. Saba hovered around her like a shadow, making comments about how it's important for a woman to know her worth in the family, and how sometimes lessons must be learned the hard way. Aisha brushed it off with nervous laughter, but her pulse quickened. She told herself she was imagining it, that maybe her paranoia was getting the better of her. By afternoon, the atmosphere had grown heavier. The house seemed unnaturally quiet, the kind of stillness that feels like the air before a storm. Aisha found herself glancing at the clock, counting the hours until Imran's nightly call. She busied herself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, but her hands trembled slightly. She caught Saba watching her from the doorway, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. When her mother-in-law called her into the sitting room, there was something in her tone, sweet, but with an undercurrent of command. Aisha hesitated at the doorway, her gaze flicking to the small table in the corner. On it sat a small tin of black powder, the kind used for old-fashioned coal but darker, almost pitch black. A cloth lay beside it, damp and folded neatly. The sight made her heart thud hard against her ribs. Her mother-in-law's smile widened. "Sit down, Aisha. We're going to fix that face of yours. You've been far too proud lately, and it's time to remind you of your place in this family." Aisha froze. The meaning hit her instantly, and her stomach churned. She had heard whispers of such things happening in distant villages, stories passed around as warnings, humiliations disguised as discipline. She never imagined it could happen to her, in the middle of a city, in what she thought was an educated home. Her first instinct was to run, but Saba stepped into the doorway, blocking her path, her expression cold and unyielding. "It's better if you cooperate," she said quietly, almost as if she was savoring the moment. Aisha's mind raced. She thought of calling Hamza, but her phone was upstairs, out of reach. The walls seemed to close in, and every breath felt heavy. She knew something terrible was about to happen, something that would not just break her spirit but strip her dignity bare for the world to see. And as the black powder sat waiting on the table, she felt the first tendrils of dread wrap tight around her heart, knowing she was utterly alone. The moment her mother-in-law lunged forward, Aisha's instincts screamed at her to move, to fight, to protect herself and the life growing inside her. But Saba's hands were already gripping her arms from behind, shoving her down into the low wooden chair. The sharp edge of the seat bit into her back as she twisted, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "Hold her still," her mother-in-law snapped, her voice ringing with authority that brooked no disobedience. Saba's grip tightened like iron, pinning Aisha in place. She kicked out in desperation, her slipper flying across the room, but her father-in-law stepped forward with a glare, his shadow looming over her. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he muttered, his tone flat, as if she were nothing more than a disobedient child. Aisha's heart thundered in her ears as her mother-in-law dipped the cloth into the black paste. The acrid smell filled her nostrils, and before she could turn her head away, the first cold smear dragged across her cheek. She jerked violently, but Saba's nails dug into her arms, holding her in place. The paste was thick, grainy, and it clung to her skin like oil, coating her face in uneven streaks. Her mother-in-law worked quickly, as if she had done this before, each swipe harsher than the last. "Let the neighbors see what kind of woman you are," her mother-in-law spat, pressing the cloth hard against Aisha's chin until her teeth ached. "A wife who disrespects her elders. A daughter-in-law who thinks she's better than the family that took her in." Aisha could barely breathe. The cold paste spread across her forehead, her nose, her lips, covering her identity, smothering her dignity. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, but tears leaked out, mingling with the black, stinging as they traced down her cheeks. Her mind screamed for escape, for help, for Hamza's voice to break through the air, but the only sounds were the scrape of the cloth and the hissed insults dripping into her ears. When the last smear was made, Saba stepped back with a satisfied smirk. "Perfect," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "Now she looks the way she should, a lesson for every woman who forgets her place." Before Aisha could wipe her face, her mother-in-law yanked her up by the arm, the sudden motion making her stumble. Pain shot through her side, and her free hand flew instinctively to her belly. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm pregnant. Please don't." "Pregnant or not, you'll learn today," her mother-in-law cut in sharply. She shoved her toward the door, and Saba followed close behind, her phone in hand as if ready to capture the spectacle. The moment the front door opened, sunlight hit Aisha's painted face, making the black sheen all the more vivid. She froze on the threshold, her legs trembling, but her mother-in-law pushed her forward with a force that nearly sent her sprawling. The street was alive with sound, the clatter of a cart rolling by, the chatter of women buying vegetables from the corner stall. Heads turned immediately. Conversations halted. A few gasps cut through the air, followed by low murmurs that seemed to echo in Aisha's skull. "There she is," her mother-in-law announced loudly, her voice carrying over the gathering crowd. "The daughter-in-law who brings shame to her family. The woman who dares to talk back to her elders." Laughter bubbled up from somewhere in the small crowd, sharp and cruel. A man whispered something to his friend, both of them shaking their heads. An elderly woman standing by her gate looked away quickly, her expression tight with discomfort. But no one stepped forward. No one stopped it. Aisha felt each stare like a lash across her skin. Her cheeks burned beneath the paint, her throat thick with unshed sobs. She tried to lower her head, to hide, but her mother-in-law's hand shot out, gripping her chin and forcing her face upward. "Look at them," she ordered. "Let them see you for what you are." Her pulse pounded so hard she thought she might faint. She could feel the baby moving faintly within her, and a fresh wave of fear washed over her. Fear that the stress, the humiliation, the sheer cruelty of this moment might harm the tiny life she carried. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt leaden, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her in-laws' voices surrounded her like a swarm of angry wasps. Saba chimed in with mocking laughter, throwing in exaggerated tales about Aisha's disrespect and arrogance. Her father-in-law nodded along solemnly, as though her disgrace was a matter of family honor. The words twisted into her mind, mingling with the faces of the crowd, until she could barely tell where the insults ended and her own thoughts began. Somewhere in the haze, she caught sight of a young boy peeking from behind his mother's shawl, his wide eyes filled with confusion. That look, innocent, uncorrupted, was the only thing that kept her from collapsing entirely. She straightened her back, just barely, even as her knees threatened to give way. Still, each step back toward the house felt heavier than the last, her shame dragging behind her like a long, unshakable shadow. When the door slammed shut behind her, she thought she might finally be able to breathe, but the air inside was no less suffocating. The black paint clung to her skin, the smell of it mixing with the taste of humiliation that she knew would linger far longer than the stains. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet resolve began to take root, that this would not be the end of her story. Hamza had been on his way home from work when his phone buzzed with an unexpected call. It was from Mrs. Khalid, an elderly neighbor who lived just a few houses down from Aisha's in-laws. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Beta, I don't know how to tell you this, but you need to come here right now. Your sister, they're doing something terrible to her." Hamza's grip tightened around the steering wheel. "What do you mean, terrible? What's going on?" "They've painted her face black," Mrs. Khalid said in a rush. "They're parading her outside. People are watching, laughing. I can't stand it." Hamza's chest burned with a fury he could barely contain. He didn't even wait for her to finish before he swung his car into a U-turn, his tires screeching. The short drive felt endless, his mind racing with images he didn't want to imagine. He thought of Aisha's laugh, her gentle voice, the way she had always looked up to him like he was her shield. And now, somewhere, she was standing alone, humiliated, and he wasn't there to stop it. When he turned into the narrow street, the sight that greeted him nearly made his vision blur with rage. There she was, his little sister, standing in the harsh daylight, her face smeared in thick black paint, streaked in places where her tears had cut through. Her dupatta hung crookedly over her head, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked smaller than he'd ever seen her, her shoulders drawn in, her eyes fixed somewhere far away as though she could disappear into herself. Around her, a small crowd had gathered. Some whispered behind their hands, others watched with idle curiosity, and a few, to Hamza's disgust, were smirking. Her mother-in-law stood proudly at her side, her voice raised for all to hear, spewing accusations about Aisha's disrespect and shameful behavior. Saba hovered nearby, her phone in her hand as if she had been recording the entire spectacle. Hamza's car door slammed open with a force that made a few heads turn. He strode forward without hesitation, his presence cutting through the crowd like a blade. Every muscle in his body was tense, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Aisha," he called, his voice low but carrying an edge that made her head snap up. The moment their eyes met, her lip quivered, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she moved, stepping toward him as if the sound of his voice had broken whatever invisible chains held her in place. Hamza closed the distance in seconds. Without a word, he took off his own handkerchief and wiped gently at her cheek, though the thick paste barely smudged. His other hand found hers, gripping it firmly, grounding her. She didn't speak, she couldn't, but her fingers tightened around his like she was afraid he might vanish. He turned then, his gaze locking on her in-laws. The fury in his eyes was cold, controlled, and infinitely more dangerous than shouting. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice like steel. Her mother-in-law didn't flinch. She needed to be taught a lesson. "Shut your mouth," Hamza snapped, the force of his words making several people in the crowd gasp. "You humiliate my sister, my pregnant sister, in the street, and you dare to justify it?" Saba stepped forward, trying to inject her own venom into the moment. "She brought this on herself. Hamza's glare silenced her mid-sentence. "The only shame here is yours," he said, his voice rising now, projecting for everyone in earshot. "You parade a woman, your own family, like this, and you call it tradition? It's cruelty. It's abuse. And you will answer for it." The crowd shifted uneasily. A few murmured in agreement. Others avoided his eyes. But Hamza didn't care about them. His focus was entirely on shielding Aisha. He shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, covering her as much as he could, his arm coming around her protectively. Her mother-in-law's voice faltered for the first time. "This is our home. You have no right." "I have every right," Hamza cut in, his tone sharp enough to slice through the air. "She is my sister before she was ever your daughter-in-law. And if you think you can treat her like this without consequences, you are gravely mistaken." He turned to Aisha, speaking softly now, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "You're coming with me. Right now. You're not staying here another minute." Aisha's eyes brimmed again, but this time it wasn't just pain, it was the first flicker of relief. She nodded, the movement small but certain. Hamza led her toward his car, his arm still wrapped around her like a barrier. The in-laws stood frozen, their earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of his unwavering defiance. As they reached the edge of the crowd, Hamza stopped and looked back one last time. "Every person here saw what you did," he said, his voice steady. "They'll remember it. And so will I. You'll regret the day you laid a hand on her." Then he opened the car door for Aisha, helping her inside with the gentleness of someone handling the most fragile thing in the world. As he drove away, she kept her gaze forward, not daring to look back. For the first time that day, she felt the air clear just enough to breathe. And though the black paint still clung to her skin, she could feel its weight beginning to lift under the shelter of her brother's presence. The car was silent at first, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Aisha sat pressed against the passenger door, her gaze fixed on the blur of the passing streets. Hamza's jacket was still wrapped around her shoulders, shielding her from the curious stares they'd attracted as they left. Her fingers clutched the fabric tightly, as if afraid that letting go would mean the safety she'd just found would vanish. Hamza gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened. Every time he glanced at her, a fresh surge of anger swelled in his chest, not just at the sight of the black paint still smeared across her face, but at the thought of how long she must have been enduring things in silence. He wanted to demand answers, to know every detail, but he also knew she needed space to breathe after what had just happened. It was Aisha who finally broke the quiet, her voice low and trembling. "I didn't want you to find out like this." Hamza's jaw tightened. "Like what, Aisha? That they're monsters? That they've been treating you like you're less than human?" His tone was sharp, but beneath it was hurt. "You should have told me. You know I would have come the moment you called." She swallowed hard, staring down at her lap. "I was afraid. Afraid you'd make it worse. Imran, he never stood up to them. If you came, they would have twisted everything, told him I was trying to break the family apart. And I didn't want." Her voice cracked. "I didn't want to lose him." Hamza's chest ached at her words. He slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road, needing to look at her properly. "Lose him? A man who lets his family do this to you isn't worth keeping, Aisha. And you haven't lost anything today, except a prison you should never have been in." Her tears spilled freely now, streaking faint trails through the black on her cheeks. "It wasn't always like this," she whispered. "At first, I thought they accepted me. But it started small, little remarks, controlling things. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I could win them over if I tried harder. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. And Imran, he just wanted peace. He told me to ignore it." Hamza's hands flexed against the wheel. "Peace for him meant silence for you. That's not love, Aisha. That's cowardice." She drew in a shaky breath, her hand instinctively moving to rest over her belly. "I kept thinking about the baby. About how I wanted them to have a father, a home. Even if it meant I had to bear everything quietly. But today, Her voice trembled. Today, I felt like I wasn't even a person anymore. Just something they could humiliate to make themselves feel powerful. Hamza reached over, taking her free hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, a lifeline. You will never go back there, he said, his voice unwavering. I don't care what anyone says, I don't care what Imran wants. You are my sister, and I will protect you. Always. Relief washed over her in slow, uneven waves. Part of her wanted to believe him completely, to let go of all the fear that had been her constant companion for months. But another part couldn't stop worrying, about the confrontation that would surely come, about how Imran would react, about the judgment from people who didn't know the full story. They resumed driving, the city slowly giving way to quieter streets. As they neared Hamza's home, Aisha leaned back against the seat, exhaustion settling deep in her bones. The black paint still clung to her skin, a physical reminder of the cruelty she had endured, but under her brother's watchful presence, the shame began to loosen its hold. When Hamza pulled into the driveway, he turned to her one last time before they got out. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Aisha. And you never will be. She met his eyes then, and for the first time that day, a faint, fragile smile touched her lips. The road ahead might be uncertain, but at least now she knew she wouldn't be walking it by herself. Hamza didn't waste time. The very next morning, after ensuring Aisha was resting at his home, he began making calls. His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the fire beneath it. He reached out to respected community elders, men and women whose voices carried weight in the neighborhood, and told them exactly what had been done to his sister. He spared no detail. By noon, word had spread far beyond the street where the humiliation had taken place. The elders called for a meeting, one that would take place in the very lane where the incident had occurred. Hamza stood tall as people gathered, his expression a mix of controlled fury and determination. Aisha didn't attend, he refused to let her face them again so soon, but her absence only fueled the outrage. They degraded a pregnant woman in public, Hamza told the crowd, his voice cutting through the murmurs. This isn't discipline. This isn't tradition. This is abuse. And we cannot let it stand. When the in-laws emerged from their home, they were met with stares colder than stone. Neighbors who once greeted them now kept their distance. A few confronted them outright, demanding to know how they could commit such an act. The mother-in-law tried to defend herself, insisting Aisha had disrespected them and needed to be taught a lesson, but the words rang hollow. The elders rebuked her sharply, reminding her that honor is built by protecting family, not by tearing them down. Hamza didn't stop with community shame. That same week, he filed a formal complaint with the local authorities. The police came to their door, asking questions, taking statements from witnesses. Saba tried to insist it was a family matter, but the officers didn't back down. The law, Hamza knew, was another weapon against the cruelty they had shown. Even if it didn't result in jail time, it would leave a mark on their record, a lasting reminder that what they had done was not just morally wrong, but criminal. Imran returned from his trip in the midst of the chaos. He walked into his parents' home to find them surrounded by scorn, whispers following them like a shadow. At first, he defended them, refusing to believe they were capable of such a thing. But the more he heard, from neighbors, from elders, even from the police, the more the denial began to crack. When Hamza finally confronted him face to face, there was no anger in his words, only cold truth. Your silence made this possible, Imran. You let them break her spirit while you looked the other way. It was only then that Imran went to see Aisha. She sat in Hamza's living room, her face clean now but still pale, her eyes guarded. He knelt before her, his voice low, almost pleading. Aisha, I didn't know. If I had. She stopped him with a small shake of her head. You didn't want to know, Imran. Every time I tried to tell you, you told me to stay quiet. That was enough for them to keep going. His shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. I'm sorry. Please, come back home. I'll make sure it never happens again. But Aisha's gaze was steady, unflinching. Home, she repeated softly. That house was never my home. and I can't trust that it ever will be." Her words cut deeper than any anger could. Imran looked at her for a long moment, then lowered his head. Hamza, standing in the doorway, didn't speak. He didn't need to. The choice had already been made. Aisha would not go back, and the family who had once taken pride in shaming her would now live with the shame they had brought upon themselves. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Aisha had experienced since her marriage. Quiet, safe, and free from the constant weight of disapproval. Hamza made sure of it. He didn't just give her a roof over her head, he created an environment where she could heal. The first thing he insisted on was a doctor's appointment to ensure both she and the baby were healthy. Sitting in the clinic, hearing the steady heartbeat of her child through the monitor, Aisha felt her chest loosen for the first time in months. It was a sound that promised life, a sound no cruelty could silence. Her days slowly took on a gentle rhythm. Mornings began with walks in the small park near Hamza's home, where the fresh air filled her lungs and sunlight warmed her skin. She cooked when she felt like it, read books in the afternoons, and sewed tiny clothes for the baby in the evenings. Hamza often returned from work with fresh fruit, baby essentials, or simply a new story to make her smile. More importantly, Aisha began to rebuild the parts of herself she'd been forced to bury. She no longer second-guessed every word or action. She could laugh freely without wondering if someone would mock her tone. She could rest when her body needed it, without the guilt of being called lazy. It was a freedom so simple, yet so powerful, that it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. The nightmares still came occasionally. Flashes of that day in the street, the cold smear of paint on her skin, the sting of hateful words. But Hamza was always there to remind her she wasn't alone anymore. Whenever fear crept in, he would place a reassuring hand on her shoulder and say, "That chapter is over, Aisha. You're writing a new one now." As her due date approached, the house became a place of quiet anticipation. Hamza helped set up a small nursery in the spare room, pale yellow walls, a simple crib, and a mobile that spun slowly, catching the light. It wasn't grand, but it was hers, and it was filled with love instead of control. Aisha found herself thinking about the future in ways she hadn't dared before. She pictured her child growing up surrounded by kindness, never knowing the sting of humiliation. She imagined birthday cakes, bedtime stories, and days spent in the park. Most of all, she imagined a life where she could stand tall, her head held high, teaching her child that respect was something earned through love, not fear. When the day finally came, it began in the early hours of the morning. The contractions were sharp but bearable at first, and Hamza rushed her to the hospital with the same fierce protectiveness he had shown the day he took her away. Hours passed in a blur of pain, encouragement, and determination. Through it all, she kept her focus on one thought, that on the other side of this struggle, there would be something pure and unbroken waiting for her. And then, at last, the room was filled with the sound of a newborn's cry. The nurse placed the tiny bundle in her arms, and Aisha felt the world narrow to just the two of them. The baby's skin was soft, his fists small but strong, his breathing quick and certain. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but these were not tears of shame or fear. They were of relief, gratitude, and an overwhelming love she hadn't known was possible. Hamza stood nearby, his eyes shining as he looked at his sister holding her child. "Welcome to the world, little one," he whispered. In that moment, Aisha knew this was her new beginning. The pain of the past would always be a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. In her arms lay hope, resilience, and the unshakable bond of family love, a reminder that even after the darkest days, life could still bloom bright and strong.